All right. Okay, so we're going to start lesson 16, the Cold War. We're going to deal with domestic and foreign policy today. And what we have on the left there is the two main rivalries of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviets. And then on the right, we'll get to this in the next lesson. We'll be dealing with hot zones in the Cold War, mainly Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. But I'm not getting into that. I'll talk a little bit about it, but I'm not getting into that today. So the Cold War begins. Most historians would sort of argue that or debate like the origin of where it all starts. So I think it's worth just mentioning the three leading Allied meetings at the end of World War II. We have Yalta in Crimea. We have San Francisco in California. That was a UN meeting predominantly. And then Potsdam in Germany. It was held between after the death of FDR, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill. All three of these meetings brought about the start of the United Nations, but the Soviets refused to give up control of what they had gained or retaken. Sorry. Excuse me. All right. They refused to give up. Thank you, guys. They refused to give up their communist claims to Eastern and Central Europe. The UN forms at the end of World War II. This creates an opportunity for nations all over the world to try to create peace and prevent future global wars. They're trying to shore up a lot of the problems that had existed in the League of Nations. They want to make sure it doesn't fall apart like the League had and end up in another world war. So, a polished version of the League. A lot of people criticized FDR then, even after his death, as well as Churchill, and even Truman was criticized for giving up Eastern Europe to communism. But we have to remember, it wasn't really theirs to give up because the Americans don't send U.S. or British, and the Brits don't send British forces on an Eastern front. So remember, as soon as American soldiers and the Soviets met along the Elbe River in Berlin on April 11, 1945, the day before FDR passed, and they shook hands there. That meeting was, I guess, a little bit warm, but everybody goes ahead and sort of draws their line in the sand. Germany is partitioned between East and West. Berlin will be partitioned between the East and West. And all those Eastern Bloc Soviet satellite countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, etc., those all are communism and under the control of Stalin and the Soviets. Churchill gives a really famous speech, the Iron Curtain speech, where he'll say, an Iron Curtain had descended across Eastern Europe. And this is what ramps up the tension of the Cold War, among many other variables. So Stalin had established a large ring of Soviet states around Russia, and they're under his totalitarian rule until his death in 1953. But the people that will follow Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, they keep the Soviet Union intact. We're going to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union later in the lesson. So the end of World War II found Soviet forces occupying most of Eastern and Central Europe. Germany was partitioned. I do want you to understand that it's going to take a while for the Berlin Wall to come up. It's initially just like paint. A strip of paint separates East and West Berlin, and a checkpoint separates East and West Germany. But over time, it intensifies, turns into barbed wire, and then it turns into this wall that will split Berlin in two. Because prior to this, people were kind of like moving back and forth across East and West Berlin. People work in East Berlin, go over and party in West Berlin, or visit family. People in West Berlin working over there, visit family in East Berlin. But over time, East Berlin is losing its top talent: doctors, lawyers, teachers, academics, civil servants. They're starting to leave East Berlin, to head to West Berlin. And a lot of them are trying to get to West Germany because that area is occupied by the Americans, the Brits, and the Free French. I often kind of compare the division of Berlin would be like if we put a partition down Huguenot and Midlothian, right? And we're like, all right, one side is is communist and the other side is democratic, and you can't move back and forth. That would be unthinkable. Well, that's kind of like a little minor example of what's happening in Berlin during this period of time. There's numerous books and films that have been written and produced dealing with the rise of the Berlin Wall. Questions up to this point? So these are American troops and Soviet soldiers meeting along the Elbe in Berlin, April 11, 1945, symbol of the United Nations. And then if you see the Berlin Wall, you can see what side's which, right? The graffitied side where the guy's casually walking his dog is West Berlin. And then that military zone with armed soldiers and another area of barbed wire, that's East Berlin. Questions up to this point? All right, so the Marshall Plan. Secretary of State under Truman, George C. Marshall, who we've talked about, was Army Chief of Staff and also served as Secretary of Defense, gave Harvard's commencement address on June 5th, 1947, and this is where he lays out the Marshall Plan. In his speech, he basically proposes the recovery plan in conjunction with the Truman Doctrine, which I'll talk a little bit about later, to rebuild war-torn Europe. Why is Marshall the right guy for the job? Well, after he graduated from VMI, he went directly into military service. He rose in the ranks, spent time with the command in the Philippines, winds up being whose right-hand man in World War I? What general who led U.S. forces in World War I? I'll give you a hint. His nickname was Blackjack. Pershing, very good. Excellent job. Then he gets out of World War I, continues to train officers, continues to strategize. He's part of the whole military buildup heading into World War II. He's FDR's Army Chief of Staff. What he understands is that what the Allies can't do in post-World War II, they can't do what they did after World War I, meaning that you can't lay down a war guilt clause, you can't horribly punish these enemies, you've got to help them rebuild. So the Marshall Plan, as Marshall said, our policy is directed not against any country nor doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. This is brilliant because there's strings attached. If you accept money from or aid from the U.S., what do you have to do? What kind of government do you have to have? Anybody want to take a guess? If you accept money from us through the Marshall Plan, what type of government are you going to put into place? Democracy. Very good. You also have to become what with us? An ally, bless you. And also, what else do you have to do with us? Trade, right? You have to trade with us, or to your point, help us. Okay? So there are strings attached with the Marshall Plan. Guys, this will set the framework of American aid and also American alliances heading into the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st century. The Marshall Plan is still considered one of the greatest pieces of American foreign policy in modern history. But Stalin is going to push back. Stalin tries to institute his own program. It doesn't really work out that well. Further, he tries to set a blockade around Berlin. The Berlin blockade occurred from the summer of 48 to the spring of 49. We're like, this is a tense moment. What are we going to do? Are we going to go to war? Are we going to start World War III over this? Are cooler heads going to prevail? Cooler heads prevail. The Americans and the Brits start an airlift to bring in supplies to West Berlin to provide for support. And ultimately, Stalin backs off and brings the blockade to an end. And again, World War III, a nuclear war, is averted. Because by this period of time, guys, the Soviets, they're testing H-bombs. They got nuclear technology. We'll talk more about that as we move forward today. We also have to remember that Japan has surrendered, right? They surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. Douglas MacArthur and U.S. forces will take occupation of Japan. Japan will be demilitarized. It will become a democratic republic. They will allow Hirohito, the emperor, to stay in there as a figurehead. But America and Japan almost immediately become trade partners. Which, how do you think that went over with some of the vets in the Pacific? Not great, but it was moving America and Japan and the world forward in the post-war era. But this also has implications in other parts of Asia. And we're going to talk about the spread of communism in China. We're going to talk about the spread of communism in North Korea. And we'll also be talking about Vietnam. So, U.S. occupation and rehabilitation of the Japanese state occurred between 1945 and 1952. It led to widespread military, political, economic, and social reforms in Japan. So that's a little bit about the Marshall Plan. Here are a number of symbols from the Cold War. I'm going to start in the top left and kind of work my way around clockwise. We've got the rise of communist China. In the top center there, that's the split up of Berlin. Soviets controlled East Berlin, and the French, the Brits, and the Americans controlled West Berlin. On the top right is the symbol of the Soviet Union, the hammer and the sickle, symbolic of what? Very good, and labor. All right, very good. This is a famous area of Berlin. That's Brandenburg Gate, and you can see what's in front of it. What's in front of Brandenburg Gate there? The Berlin Wall. Over on the right, that's the symbol of the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong. We'll talk more about them as we move into our lesson next class. Bottom right, that's a service medal from the Vietnam War. This is an American GI, General Infantryman in Vietnam. This is a really interesting U-2 spy imaging from the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is what is called a dust-off. This is a scene from Vietnam. Over on the left, tank warfare from Korea. And then the Korean Peninsula will be split along the 38th degree parallel. South Korea, Democratic, North Korea, Communist. And that is going to be another topic of discussion. Next class, we'll be talking about the Korean War. Any questions about any of that symbolism? Oh, I forgot. Smack dab in the middle, that's the symbol of a fallout shelter. Has anyone ever seen those before? Has anyone ever been in a fallout shelter before? Nobody? Okay. So, containment of communism. The U.S. anti-communist strategy of containment was not to roll communism back where it existed, but to prevent it from spreading. Because if America tried to go into the Soviet Union and eradicate communism, it would probably lead to what? World War III, right? So they still want communism to spread. The guy that writes this position of containment is George F. Kennan under the pseudonym X in the Journal of Foreign Affairs. He was a member of the State Department. This ultimately becomes what is known as the Truman Doctrine, which basically means the containment of communism. This is what gets, the Truman Doctrine is what gets America involved in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War will demonstrate the power of American public opinion in reversing foreign policy. We'll talk more about that next class. Containment tested the democratic system to its limits and left a lot of scars on American society, which we're going to talk about today. Because in this era, if you were accused of being a communist, it could totally destroy your life. You could lose your job. You could be ostracized from your community. And that was a very real issue that was happening. So a lot of Americans became skeptical of our future military and diplomatic interventions because we start to get involved in a lot of different activity globally. We get involved in the UN, pretty much lead the UN operation in Korea. We insert ourselves in Vietnam. We insert ourselves in Cuba. And that's just scratching the surface. I call a lot of this stuff what we would consider Cold War leftovers. But it's a competition between two very different ways of governing. The American-led Western nations' belief in democracy, individual freedom, and a free market economy, capitalism, where the Soviets' belief was a totalitarian state, dictatorial rule, socialism, and a communist economy. But these cartoons on the right are pretty significant because on that top right cartoon, it's a little tiny Uncle Sam scared that communism will spread across the world and to the U.S. But look, there's a flip side of this. There's that little communist bear, symbol of the Soviet Union, fearful that democracy and capitalism will spread globally. Any questions up to this point? Okay. So the threat of communism, the Cold War ends as soon as World War II, the Cold War begins as soon as World War II ends. The Cold War is basically like a 45-year period. It exists from the end of World War II to roughly the late 80s, early 1990s. If we want to really put the pin in it, we could say it's 89, but the beginning of the end starts in 86. Does anybody know what horrible disaster occurred in Ukraine in 86? It was a nuclear meltdown. Chernobyl, very good. The beginning of the end starts with Chernobyl in 86, but really the legit end of this kind of comes to a conclusion around 91 or 92. Every president in this era has to deal with these Cold War issues. And we're talking Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. All of them are dealing with it. And then after the post-war era, post-Cold War era, we've got Cold War leftovers that more modern-day presidents have had to address. Issues with North Korea, issues in the Middle East, issues with Cuba, issues in Latin America, in South America, Central America, that have involved Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump again. These are all, like I said, Cold War leftovers. What the Truman Doctrine, the containment of communism, was fearful of what was called the domino theory. And I'm glad your grandfather brought this up about the domino theory. And he said, like, well, not enough people know about Laos and Cambodia. We're actually going to talk about that next class because that's the domino theory coming to fruition. Like, Korean War, it ends where it starts, right? Like, the 38th degree parallel, like, everything, and there's still tension there. North Korea remains communist, South Korea remains democratic. But Vietnam, once Vietnam falls to communism, bordering Laos and Cambodia will fall as well. So what's really interesting about the Cold War, the fear of the spread of communism and the fear of nuclear war was like the most bipartisan issue happening. To appear weak on communism, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, just wasn't acceptable. This leads to two significant organizations being formed for alliances. We have NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed primarily by the U.S., the Brits, the French, among other allied nations, non-communist nations in the post-war era. Basically what NATO said was, hey, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us, right? So in recent years, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's this hot topic on whether or not, Ukraine is saying, oh, we'd really like to join NATO. Will they? I don't know. They won't join NATO until that war's over, right? If they join. Actually, on the news this morning, they're still talking about that. The Warsaw Pact, this is the Soviet alliance, but the Warsaw Pact is interesting because basically what the Warsaw Pact is an alliance among the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So give me some examples of communist countries that never joined Warsaw. Help me out. Maybe throw a few communist nations out that are not in Eastern Europe or Central Europe. Cuba never joins. China never joins. Anybody else? Well, they're leading it. North Korea doesn't join. Vietnam doesn't join. So that's just, Warsaw's a little trickier. Ultimately, Warsaw fades away. NATO still exists. And there's, in the modern era, in the 21st century, there's constant grappling over NATO partners paying their fair share for NATO funding and defense. It's easy to kick Nixon around for Watergate, obviously, and we'll talk more about this in contemporary America. But there's one thing that Nixon did quite well as president, and that was the exploitation of the Soviet and Chinese rivalry. When China fell to communism, Soviets were elated, and that relationship was an alliance. But over time, it starts to deteriorate, and the two of them come into competition. Nixon will be the first president to visit, U.S. president to visit China, and he won't be the first to visit Soviet Union. Obviously, FDR attended Yalta at the end of World War II, but he's going to open up trade relationships with China. He's also going to start to try to negotiate and smooth things out with the Soviets. I wouldn't say that this is the beginning of the end of the Cold War because it's still a little early, but because we're still in the midst of the space race and the arms race in this era of the 70s. The reason that the arms race really picked up was actually during the Eisenhower era. After Truman, Eisenhower is going to come forth with policy known as massive retaliation. If the Soviets attack us, we're going to attack them tenfold. So this is to deter nuclear strikes by the Soviets. Because by the time Eisenhower gets into office, the Soviets have successfully gained the nuclear secrets and are successfully detonating hydrogen bombs. Over there on the left, we have Eisenhower with the massive retaliation. And on the right, those mustard-colored countries, those are NATO countries. And that, like, sort of, I don't know, bluish green Soviet Union and the satellite countries, those are the Warsaw countries. All right. So the impact of the Cold War on Americans at home, the fear of communism or the threat of nuclear war, like sort of affects American life. As I mentioned before, talk with your grandparents, ask them about their Cold War experience, especially if your grandparents were alive, which they most likely were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll talk about next class. During the 50s and 60s, my parents, your grandparents, participated in fallout drills and bomb drills at school. They were called duck and cover drills that were presented by that dude right there in the center, Bert the Turtle. Duck and cover. Anybody ever seen that before? That cartoon? I'm going to share it with you. People started building bomb shelters. Guess who you could buy a bomb shelter from? It would show up at your house. You could buy your bomb shelter, your guns, and your canned food from this company, and they would show up, drop it off, and you build your own bomb shelter. Sears. Very good. Excellent job. You could buy a bomb shelter from Sears. So people, how many of you guys have family that went to Radford, or you guys have any desire to go to Radford? Anybody? Radford connections? Radford University. Okay. Well, Radford, outside of Radford is Dublin, and there's a huge munitions factory there, but it was really big one during the Cold War, and they were super worried that there was going to be a nuclear strike. So there's all types of bomb shelters in and around Montgomery County, Radford area, Dublin area, even fallout shelters in Blacksburg, where my Hokies at. All right, so it's kind of wild that, and we see this happen all over. There's apparently somebody in another class was telling me there's kind of a crazy bomb shelter that you can visit out in Powhatan. Has anyone ever heard of the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs? The Greenbrier secretly built a fallout shelter for the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court, or the entire executive branch for that matter, not just the president. You can actually tour that at the Greenbrier now. This is also an era of espionage. I'm going to talk about a couple of suspected spies here in a minute. Alger Hiss and the Pumpkin Papers, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg connected to the Klaus Fuchs spy ring. Obviously, the Soviets are in the nuclear game now. Chinese are going to get in the nuclear game. And this ramps up fear, saber rattling, and we get close. I mean, Cuban Missile Crisis, War Games was another one. There's some near, very close calls that occurred during the Cold War. And then, of course, the increased domestic fears of communism. So on the top there, top right, we have a fallout shelter. Over to its right is a detonation. So an atomic test. In the middle there is Bert the Turtle and the duck and cover drills. And then there in the bottom is a fallout shelter. Cool. So the Pumpkin Papers. So Alger Hiss, top right, had been a member of the State Department since the FDR administration was a new dealer, had been involved in politics. But there's this guy in Whitaker Chambers that comes forward who's a reformed communist, and he basically says, hey, you've got a communist in the State Department in your midst, and I have proof that he has been passing along classified information. He's been hiding these documents and hollowed out pumpkins. Now, in our minds, we would think like he has wads of paper jammed into pumpkins. That's not the case. Everybody in here has seen a reel of film, right? In our life, yeah. And we know that when we move the reel fast, right, the pictures roll. Well, what they had then is what was called microfiche. And each frame of film was a document. And you'd run it through a machine and you could read these documents. This is before documents were digitized. What Alger Hiss is accused of is taking these rolls of microfiche or microfilm and putting them in these hollowed out pumpkins. And this whole thing goes in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was headed up by a very ambitious member of Congress, Richard M. Nixon. Any Simpsons fans in the house? Anybody? All right. That's how Milhouse got his name, by the way. Richard Milhouse Nixon. So, HUAC is investigating those. Hiss is put on trial for espionage. Well, the defense is like, look, he didn't do this. There's not enough evidence to convict him of espionage. And the prosecution is trying to cobble together the evidence. Clearly, they've got the microfiche. They can't identify whether Hiss has actually been the one to drop. Was this dropped off by somebody else? Are they framing in what? And then the defense says, yeah, Hiss doesn't even know this man. And then the prosecution, that's their slam dunk. They're like, oh yeah? You don't know him? Well, why did you sell Whitaker Chambers a car? He had sold him a used car. There's documentation of that. So they don't get Hiss for espionage. They get Hiss for lying under oath, which is called what? You lie under oath. It's called what? Very good. Perjury. Excellent job. Nice job, guys. So they get him for perjury. Gets a 5-year sentence. He serves 3 years, but it totally destroys the guy's life. So that's one of the high-profile espionage cases. The next one, way, way bigger, all right? Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So, Klaus Fuchs, have you ever heard of this person before? No one? Okay, wonderful. Happy to teach you a little bit about Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs is the guy that passes along the nuclear secrets to the Soviets. Tied in with the Klaus Fuchs ring is an associate named Henry Gold. And tied to Henry Gold are a couple named David and Ruth Greenglass. Ruth and David's brother and sister-in-law, Julius and Ethel. Most of the people in the spy ring that got convicted struck deals. They got long prison sentences. Some of these people even got life sentences. But Julius and Ethel decided to plead the what? Fifth. Not to incriminate themselves. In one of the most controversial trials, convictions, and sentences in American history, Julius and Ethel will be convicted of espionage, and they will receive death by electric chair. This is like Sacco and Vanzetti stuff from the first Red Scare, right? They just don't have the evidence. There's still people debating this. I listened to a podcast a year ago where this was drummed up yet again. So that's a little bit about some of the high-profile espionage cases of the Cold War. That's where we wrap up today. McCarthyism and the American buildup in Virginia. So HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, that was largely led by Nixon, but there were some other high-profile, mostly Republican members of Congress that were tied to HUAC. This Republican senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, he wants in on it. And he has a list of suspected communists. And what happens, though, is that a lot of the people that he's accusing of being communists aren't communists. And this is a period of time where if you accuse somebody of being communist, you ruin their lives. Well, McCarthy gets famous because of this. And the accusations ramp up. And he starts to claim that there are communists in the State Department, there are communists in the U.S. military, and there's this like deep state. Well, his trials start to become televised and start to become public. And then the public starts to realize what McCarthy's doing. A lot of this is these are just witch hunts. And a lot of the people that have been accused have nothing to do with the American communist infiltration, and their careers have been destroyed. So, how many of you guys have read The Crucible by Arthur Miller? A lot of you guys. The era of McCarthy is what inspires Miller to write the book. So, this is obviously a very tense time in the Cold War, the era of McCarthyism. And you can see there on the top right, he's presenting, and look, everybody's got their like head in their hands because so much of it is just not real. So again, he really starts to mess up when he accuses personnel in the Pentagon and the U.S. military of being suspected communists. So, heavy military expenditures during the Cold War. Virginia most certainly will benefit from this. The buildup of the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Little Creek, the buildup of this is now like the formation of the U.S. Air Force coming out of World War II. Eustis is an example. We go up to Northern Virginia, Quantico, the Pentagon, munitions factories all over the state. Numerous military installations will grow as a result of the Cold War. So again, a lot of Americans sacrificed everything during the Cold War, and a lot of their service is largely forgotten. And we're going to be talking about that service when we get into the next part of our lesson. That's going to be the hot zones during the Cold War: Korea, Vietnam, Cuba. So over there, the middle picture to the right, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and then on the bottom there's the Pentagon. Questions? You guys good? All right, cool. So